Nikki Ladue January's death was ruled a suicide. Her mother, Bonnie Ladue, says her 30-year-old daughter would never have killed herself, especially with her 5-year-old son just feet away.
I believe she was murdered in cold blood.
Bonnie, along with journalist Norm Whitehurst, who's been writing about Nikki's death, says there are a lot of questions surrounding the crime scene and investigation, starting with how the body and gun were found.
Looks to me like a very unlikely way for a person to commit suicide. She was found sitting in the corner of the balcony with a small glass table in front of her, sitting in a chair. Her right knee was propped up on the table. Her left leg was outstretched.
Bonnie believes Nikki's hands wouldn't naturally end up where they did.
The hand would go to the temple, and then as soon as the shot was made, you would think that the hand would go out, drop the gun, and the hand would end up down there and the gun on the floor. Instead, her hand is very gently covering her left hand, and the gun is under her thigh. It looks completely staged.
She's sitting on the gun almost, right?
She's sitting on the gun.
How do you commit suicide and then after the fact raise your leg to a point where the gun is just going to neatly fall under it?
That doesn't make sense.
Something else that doesn't make sense to them: the cigarettes on the table. One pack was Nikki's brand, the other wasn't. Any DNA lifted, fingerprints lifted off the...
They did not look. They
No.
did not look, no.
Nothing
And
off
it
the
was an
cigarettes.
ashtray full of cigarette butts. They cleared the scene in 2 hours without gathering any of the forensic evidence. They just wrote this off as a suicide.
Crime Watch Daily asked forensics expert Dr. Bill Smock to look at the initial investigation and give us his unbiased opinion. You took a look at Nikki Ladue January's case, right? What were your initial thoughts?
Polaroid pictures of the crime scene, no autopsy performed, minimal effort on part of the investigator. This is not the way to do an investigation.
And Smock agrees. The location of the gun looks suspicious.
The way the gun was found tucked under her leg, I think somebody intentionally, unintentionally, moved that gun and stuck it under her left leg.
But right there should warrant an investigation because it means the scene was disturbed.
Absolutely.
There's also the case of the cigarette butts, right? 2 different packages of cigarettes. No DNA tests?
No DNA test.
I mean, head scratching, right?
This is perplexing. I think this police department should answer why, if you do not conduct an autopsy, you don't answer those basic questions about what happened. How can you clear this case if you don't do basic investigative steps?
But Smock says the blood evidence does point to something definitive: Nikki having both hands on the gun.
I didn't see any forward spatter where the bullet came out of the left side of her head. She did have back spatter on the back of her hand, actually on both hands, but it was predominant on the back of her left hand.
And what does that indicate?
Well, what it can indicate is if you are holding the gun, for example, if you were to take a gun, put it to your head, and then you put your left hand on the barrel to hold it steady, then you get spatter on the back of this hand, and it kind of protects any spatter from coming on the fingers or your forearm.
And in this case, would Nikki Ladue have had both her hands on the firearm?
Based upon the pattern, it looks like she had both her left hand on the barrel and the right hand on the handle of the gun.
Did Nikki or someone else possibly put her hands in that position? Some say Nikki's relationship with her husband Phil January may hold some critical answers. Norm Whitehurst even alleges there was emotional abuse in the house. Describe Nikki and Phil's relationship, their marriage in particular.
If you talk to Phil, which I did, it was a marriage made in heaven. If you talk to her friends and family, quite the opposite. She described feeling threatened in a way that he needed to control her. He would leave notes on cupboard doors in their apartment that would disparage her, that would call her vile names.
Was Nikki planning on staying in the relationship, or was she looking for a way out?
According to Phil, they were going to move to Louisiana, but there's a few friends who have said, no, that's not the case. What Nikki told us is that she's done. She can't take it anymore.
Was Nikki about to leave Phil, What was going on in the hours leading up to her death? According to Whitehurst, what was going on was a flurry of phone calls.
There was several phone calls between Nikki and Phil. Phil was supposedly driving back from Louisiana. The phone calls took place, I believe, between 1 and 2:30 in the morning. I think there was 14, 15 calls.
Why so many calls? What were they talking about? And did Phil January have an alibi that night? Whitehurst says cops looked into it.
They were able to pull phone records that showed that the number was blocked. And that's all they know. They didn't do anything like checking with cell phone towers for pinging and things like that to see what his location was. He could have been 300 miles away. He could have been in the same room as her.
According to the police report, January told cops he talked to Nikki once at 1:45 a.m. And there was something else that some consider strange. After investigators found what they called a suicide note on January's home computer, Phil had the hard drive of the computer wiped clean.
He had his teenage son erase the hard drive so he would never see that note. Come to find out, or as Phil says it, that wasn't a suicide note at all.
So it wasn't even a suicide note?
It was. She was apologizing and telling him that she wants to be a better person or a better wife.
Okay, but he tells his son to wipe the computer clean?
That's correct.
In Bonnie's desperate search for answers, she hires 2 private investigators. One of them interviews Phil January. The audio from that meeting was recorded.
How would you characterize your relationship with Nikki? Nikki was my wife. Did Nikki ever say that she did not want to do this?
January describes the moment he found his wife.
First thing I thought was she had fallen asleep out there, until I actually saw her. And you sent me pictures, so you know what I saw.
And the position of the gun, which he says he didn't touch, left him feeling unsettled.
Very odd. And I remember thinking that at the time. And not only that, it's turned opposite of what it, to me, looks like somebody in front of her would have placed it, not what you would have placed it yourself. And now, by all indications, Nikki did not like guns. She hated them.
January even admits to having the computer's hard drive erased after the alleged suicide note was found.
I had my son do it. And what reason? I didn't ever want to see it. I told him to get rid of everything.
Interestingly enough, January believes, like his mother-in-law, Nikki would not have taken her own life.
You think she would do that? Nikki would never have done that.
So who could have wanted Nikki dead? An ominous theory has emerged.
There are some people that think that it could have been organized crime that killed her. I've heard the word, this was a warning, this is a warning. Why Nikki was chosen to be the victim, I don't know. But there are people that think that this was a warning, whether it was a warning to the people that were at the casino, whether it was a warning to Phil, I don't know.
Allegedly, Nikki had received 3 threatening notes in her locker at the casino around the time of her death.
The 3 notes, did you ever see them? In fact, she told me she'd thrown them all away. What were the gist of the notes? You know, she said the notes called her a and she was being threatened.
Do those notes hold the key to Nikki's death? Coming up.
Whether he actually did it, I don't know, but he may have answers.
We also have questions for Phil January.
Hey, Mr. January, my name's Jason Mattera with Crime Watch Daily.
Her death took place, I believe, because she was about to start a new life. She was about to get away from the entire scenario that she had lived within.
That scenario, Bonnie believes, was the seedy underworld of the casino where she worked.